Chris DeWitt is from New England. He came west to attend UC Davis studying materials science, and he never went back. Following school, he worked in the Bay Area when an opportunity to work at the newly started California State Railroad Museum became available in 1977. Chris moved to Nevada in 1981 when the newly started Nevada State Railroad Museum opened. He has been there ever since. Chris's specific museum focus is in industrial fine arts, antebellum to the year 1900. Not only does he oversee the care of the rail collection, but he also assists other state institutions with their large artifacts. Among others, Chris has participated in heavy maintenance of the Nevada State Museum's coin press, State Park's Fort Churchill rifle field pieces, and the Nevada Historical Society's bullion scale. Chris is also a national ski patroller, an avid sailor, and a grandfather of 9. Please welcome Chris DeWitt.
Don't stand in front of that, they say. I'm going to talk about a specific piece at the Railroad Museum. Let's see, how does this work? Imagine we just push this. Oh, there we go. I'm going to talk about this locomotive specifically. I'm going to talk about how it came to be here, what it went through, and then what we did to it. So in 1875, the mines were just roaring in Virginia City, and they consumed amazing quantities of wood, and they rapidly logged out the eastern face of the Carson Range, cleaned out what little bit there was in the Virginia foothills, and some entrepreneurs realized that there would be a great market for wood, so they went to Lake Tahoe, which was old growth, and bought up the lumber rights and started lumbering prior to 1875, sometime in 1872. The family's name was Bliss. Realizing that the amount of material they had to move was more than they could do with horse teams and oxen, they built a railroad from the lake, from Glenbrook, up to the summit of Spooner, flumed the lumber down into Carson, loaded it back on a rail car, and took it up the hill to Virginia City. So that railroad is this one right here from Glenbrook to there. The locomotive came in, but first off, it's a narrow gauge locomotive, meaning the tracks it ran on were 3 feet apart. The transcontinental was standard gauge, that's 4 foot 8 and a half. So it came out on the flat car, along with its sister locomotive, the Tahoe. And then they had to get it, after it came to Reno, they got it to Carson City, then they put it on a wagon and they drug it up the hill with oxen. Regrettably, there are no photographs of that. I would love to see that. And they built the railroad in '75, and it ran until 1899, when the lumber was playing out, the timber was playing out, but so were the ore bodies, and mining was basically dead in Virginia City by that time. The stalwart people with axes went out into the woods, and they cut trees down, they threw them in the lake, and they dragged them over to Glenbrook. I'm sure you could get away with this today. They set up a huge industrial complex in Glenbrook. There were 3 sawmills. This is a great picture. Down in the corner, there's a water wheel. I don't know what that building did. I'm sure somebody could tell me, but I don't want to admit my ignorance. The railroad took off and went out the left side of the picture and wound up on top of the hill eventually. This is one of the close-ups of the sawmill, that Shakespeare Rock behind it. Some of them were steam-powered, and eventually they were electrified. I'm not sure where they got the electricity from, but if you drive Highway 80 west out of Reno, just as you get to the Truckee River Canyon, there's a little power plant sort of down on the river, tiny little building that is still making electricity today. That was the first power plant in the area, and that was put in specifically to power Virginia City. And they're still running, making power today. Not very much compared to what reality is, but it's still going. Somebody ran power out of Carson City over the hill into Glenbrook and started running electric sawmills. Another distinction of Glenbrook is that that's where they put the Tahoe together, the largest steamship on Lake Tahoe, which was scuttled in the late 30s by the Bliss family so that it wouldn't be cut up for scrap for the war effort. I'm not sure I buy that story, but I'll go along with it. So this was the operation. The railroad primarily hauled milled lumber. They cut the trees down, they sawed them into timbers in Glenbrook, they shipped them over the hill. They also shipped over the hill an awful lot of slash and smaller sticks for fuel. The wood demand in Virginia City was mining, so there's reinforcing the holes they dug in the ground so they wouldn't collapse on people. Burning the wood to make the steam, to run the machinery, to get the ore body out and process it, and then obviously houses and the infrastructure of the town. There was a phenomenal amount of lumber. This is in Prairie Meadows, heading uphill. There are 6 cars on that train. That is as many as they ever ran, and I'll explain to you why they never ran more than that. It's a delightful walk if you want to go do a nice hike. Walking the old right-of-way down to the lake. We're almost at the lake. The stuffy people won't let you get near the water. So this is basically the railroad layout. Down in the lower left corner is Glenbrook, and it wound on up. And up there, sort of at the top, you can see that the tracks do some weird things there. It was so steep that they had to sort of saw their way up the hill. These are called switchbacks. The one on the top is the limiting length of the train switchback. You could only put 6 cars in the locomotive out there on that switchback and then throw the switch and then head uphill. That particular piece of railroading looked like that. It was built out on a trestle, went out into space. I don't know if anything ever went off the end. It wasn't too many years ago you could walk up there and still find timbers and sundry lying there. Unfortunately, they were well on their way to returning back to the earth, and today there's virtually nothing left. Turning around and looking up the hill, we see this site. The tracks in the lower right-hand corner come around the photographer and go out onto that trestle that I just showed you, that switchback. And then on the left side proceeds up the hill and around, and there's, in fact, a train sitting on up there. I don't know. Waiting to have his picture taken, I'd imagine. This is a Watkins picture. You can see Mr. Watkins standing down at the bottom with his camera. Highway 50 from Spooner Summit to Incline Village is actually that horizontal line where the dark blobs are. That's actually a train. That's Highway 50. And above it is a massive stockpile of firewood. And they were just feeding the Comstock. When it got to the top of the hill, they stacked the lumber up, they threw it in the flume, it headed down towards Carson City. The train would pull up, there are some sloping structures in there, it would pull up alongside those, just on the other side, and they would just throw the lumber off and it would slide down the sloping structure, and then these fine dapper gentlemen there having their picture taken. We don't know who they are. We don't really care. They put a token board in for the photographer to get a picture of. Not too many years ago, you used to be able to go up and find that flume, and it's a wooden flume, and this is at the top where it was lined with sheet metal. I think to be able to handle that constant buffering of the wood sliding into the flume and heading down. Unfortunately, there is no more of that up there that at least I've been able to find in the last few years. It headed down the hill. I've been told that this is this Spooner flume. I can't prove that. This obviously, early in this, we think this is in the spring. They didn't run the flume particularly in the wintertime for ice dams and problems of that nature. It looks like it needs a little maintenance, and we think it's in early spring because there are no leaves on the aspens yet. So they're getting ready to send some timber down, probably fix the flume, get some timber running down, and it ran down into a yard at the bottom of Highway 50 in Carson City, and split off. This little flume here was obviously firewood, and that one was firewood. And then the timber went on, and the amount of timber that they stockpiled is phenomenal. The Railroad Museum, at which I work, it's sort of over on the left side, this side of that hill that comes in, and across the street, across Carson Street, they built the National Guard building back in sometime in the 70s, I'm not sure. When they went down and started scraping dirt off, they went through a fairly thick layer of wood chips and bark that was left over from the yard that had just been sitting there forever. There's a little locomotive sitting in the hole there, waiting to take a load out. There's some really optimistic people getting way back there, and they've got their face in the picture, but we don't know who they are. I don't even know if they're waving, to be honest with you. And then the Virginia and Truckee Railroad hauled this material up the hill and into the mining district, where it was put down on the ground and burnt and built into things. An incredible amount of wood went up there. So I said that the railroad played out, or pardon me, the lumbering played out in roughly 1899. The ore bodies had already been cleaned out by then. The Bliss family, who still owned the railroad, realized that the next best thing to do was to engage in tourism after they denuded all the hills of Lake Tahoe of all their big trees. And they moved their railroad to North Lake Tahoe, Tahoe City, and built the railroad to Truckee, so the trains coming over the hill, people could get off and catch the train down to the lake, and that is the Glenbrook over there, the locomotive I'm actually going to speak about. And the Tahoe, we saw that up on the hard in an earlier image. This is in Tahoe City. The narrow gauge ran until about 1925, and I keep meaning to look up the real date, but it's somewhere around there. I don't know when it is. When SP realized that it was a cash cow, bought the narrow gauge railroad, turned it into standard gauge so they could bring full-size coaches down. The railroad ran up into Truckee. We see it there. Locomotive's looking a little worse for wear there. They relettered it. They upgraded it. Right in front of the cab, there's a couple of tall cylinders. They changed the headlamp over to a Sutherland to satisfy the federal regulations. And it was a railroad. What the hell can you say on it? Damn railroad. Again, another picture of the locomotive looking a little worse for wear. Stands for Lake Tahoe Railway and Transportation Company. The narrow gauge equipment, the Glenbrook, and its sister, the Tahoe, were then sold to the Nevada County Narrow Gauge, which ran from Nevada City, California to Colfax. And that was a mining railroad. So they were bringing machinery and people and supplies into Nevada City and hauling basically gold concentrate back out. And this locomotive, the Glenbrook, was purchased as a parts engine for the Tahoe. And it looks terrible. It looks absolutely horrible. Somebody's stolen the bell and the air pump is missing, and it just looks a little rough. The matriarch of the Bliss family, Miss Hope Bliss, wanted to do something. I think she was getting old. She was old. She wanted to do something, a grand gesture for the family to be recognized and remembered. So she bought this locomotive. And the story of her buying it and going down, buying it from the railroad and then going over and getting the sheriff and going to the railroad with her papers saying, I want all the locomotive, and all the locomotive means all the missing parts too. She was a very forceful woman. She bought the locomotive, she put it on a flat car, had it put on a flat car, and shipped it by Southern Pacific Railroad from Colfax over to Reno, and Reno to Carson City. This is in Carson City in front of the engine house. And it looks pretty bad. Had she not done that, there's an excellent chance this would have been cut up for the war effort, because it was, at that point in time, already 75 years old. Well, 65 years old and not much economic use. It got put outside the Nevada State Museum, which is downtown in Carson City, the old Mint building. This is on the north side. And they kind of prettied it up a little bit. After they put her back together as much as they could, she went back to Nevada City, to the railroad, and demanded the rest of the parts. There's a lovely story about somebody had buried pieces of it in the garden in their house to protect it from vandals or something. It's a very convoluted story. I'm sure history has not embellished that story. It's totally factual. In 1980, the Nevada State Museum sort of was created, sort of burst forth. The reason it did is because Nevada had in its possession a lot of old railroad equipment. And it was just sort of sitting around, not doing anything. And several organizations attempted to do great things with it. And several organizations failed miserably because this is not a cheap game. This is a very expensive game to play. And the state basically said, do something with all this railroad equipment or we're going to get rid of it because it's a nuisance. So that's where I come into the picture. California State Railroad Museum had spent 4 years, 77 through 81, doing all the restoration of all the pieces that are in that building and built the building in Sacramento, such that at the grand opening in May of 1981, they could just open the doors and it was done. It's amazing what happens if you throw tens of millions of dollars at a project. And then they fired the entire restoration, conservation, preservation staff. There are no museums in the California state system. This is a subtle point. There are state parks. The Railroad Museum is a park entity. Parks people, and I hope I'm not offending anybody, empty trash cans, shoo people off of the grass, make sure that the place is locked at night. That's about all they do. They want a static, that's how it looks, that's how it's always going to look, kind of, at least at that point in time. Is there modus operandi? This one was starting up. A company out of Southern California that had a history of restoration and preservation in the railroad business, contracted with the state of Nevada. I was hired on. I was a complete pain in somebody's ass, but in an endearing sort of way, and that's almost a direct quote. But I was very good at this work, so they tolerated me. In 1981, they said, well, this locomotive sitting outside the main museum is sort of, it's old, been there a long time, it's a pain in the butt. Let's send it to the Railroad Museum, which is like a mile and a half south. So we went, we picked it up, and we put it on a trailer, and we took it back down, and we took the asbestos off of it, which was not as big a deal today as then as it is today, but it was a big deal. We had to get rid of it. And we ended up with a denuded locomotive. The guy on the left is Tim Horn, an amazingly good woodworker, but a complete whack job. The guy was crazier than a loon. And then the other guy, that's me, leaning on a very tired locomotive. This project took a long, long time to complete. I believe this is a 1983 photograph. And I say that because of the building in the back when it was built. It's across the street. We didn't finish this until 2015. And the problem with projects of this nature is funding. It's always funding. Granted, it's a state institution, but I'm paid by gaming revenues and room tax. That's where my salary comes from, and the other people that work with me in the shop. We go every 2 years with our hat in our hand, begging for money. And so money's a tight commodity. We needed to do projects that showed great advancements in the collection. We were doing a lot of stuff, making things look really good because people really like pretty things in museums. This was going to be a very expensive project. The museum very early on decided that if they were going to have locomotives and they could run, or cars and they could be used in service, they would. Because, quite frankly, if they're not running, then they're just things. It's like if you give somebody, say a museum like this, a hammer, and they put the hammer in a glass box and they charge you money to see that. Well, it looks like a hammer, but it's not really a hammer. Hammers hit things. That thing in the glass box is just an objet d'art sitting there, not collecting dust because it has a cover on it. So the attitude since day one was, if we can run them safely and make them operable, let's do that. And that was the goal of this particular locomotive. At this particular point in time, we were operating under the Fleischmann grants, the guy that invented the yeast and the gin. He left Nevada a whole mess of money. The museum got a little piece of it. The university got a lot of it, Fleischmann Planetarium, for instance. Parks got some. I don't know who else got some. There was bushels of money wandering up and down Carson Street in front of the Capitol building. So the first thing we did was the easy part. We restored the tender. I'm going to say this is the second restoration. We restored the tender in 1984. We got the pattern wrong because the evolution of rail preservation in America was there was an industry with a lot of steam trains and cars and people rode passenger trains, and then the automobile came around in the 50s, the 40s and the 50s, and passenger travel went away, steam went away, diesels came in, the whole rail industry sort of hit a big slump. I'm not sure it's actually gotten out of it. We don't see a lot of railroads, but it's pretty active. And then rail enthusiasts who were enthusiastic about railroads when they were younger were getting older, and when they got older, they had money, and so they started going and looking for these things. And the initial preservation was, open a barn, there's a locomotive, let's sandblast it, run it until it breaks, and park it and go find another one. That was the whole. And then when we got into California State Railroad Museum, we got into the brutal, wholesale, heroic restorations. There are beautifully restored cars in that museum, and I can say this because I worked there, of which there is no original fabric. We essentially took the car apart and rebuilt the whole car all over again in brand new wood, brand new paint, brand new castings and seats and headliners and lamps. We don't do that anymore. Anyway, we started in on the tender. The people that got into the research and the history and suddenly really hadn't coalesced into a fraternity of people that could tell you where to go find the correct pattern. Nowadays, we know exactly where they are. The Bancroft, the DeGollier, the one on the East Coast begins with an H. Come on, it's a great museum. I can't remember what it's called. Hagley, the Hagley Museum. So we redid this. This is the correct livery. This is just before we outshopped it. There's a big name panel on the side. They wanted a fancy locomotive. They had a lot of money. There was a lot of silver and gold floating around back in 1875 when they bought these. But they didn't want too much glitz. So although they got the gold leaf and the maroon striping, they didn't paint the name on the side of the locomotive, tender, or the name of the railroad. Just an oddity of some sort. That would be in 87, we restored the chassis. So this is the drivers and the cylinders, and we went through and did all the mechanical work and put axles in it and turned the drivers and replaced bushings and did all sorts of wonderful things there. The company that was contracted with the state of Nevada, starting in 1981, was run by a brilliant but arrogant individual who really thought he knew exactly what he was doing. And I say he was arrogant because when it came time to deal with a boiler, the heart of this thing, where we make the steam, he had done an awful lot of things in his life, but he had never built a new boiler and reboilered a locomotive. So he convinced the state of Nevada that what they needed to do was build a new boiler. And he went out to the old boiler and he dimensioned it all up and drew it, and it was a spectacular set of drawings.
But down on the bottom where it says drawn by, checked by, and approved by, it was Bill and Bill and Bill. Nobody checked his work. He wouldn't let anybody check his work. So when the boiler showed up, it didn't fit. He had, unfortunately, subsequently died, so he could not rub his nose in it. So we had gotten here, preparatory to the new boiler, and when the new boiler showed up and we tried to put it in the locomotive, it was not correct. It was a beautiful boiler, don't get me wrong. Brand new code boiler, U-Betchums, really nice. But what this allowed to happen was that company, after Bill died, did not survive well. He was the leader of it. That company left. I assumed the contracts with the state of Nevada, convinced the state of Nevada that what they needed to do was hire me, because 15% of all the money we were spending was going in my pocket as profit, running a company, and what they needed to do was hire me and people that I wanted to work with. It allowed us to restore the original boiler. So boilers go bad because they rust either on the inside or the outside. They're made out of inferior material, which no longer meets the safety requirements of today. The design is bad. The work that they did no longer is accepted as a viable way to build a pressure vessel. Or it's broken. I mean, it's just something is horribly broken. This boiler on this locomotive, during the years that it ran out of Lake Tahoe, only ran snowmelt water, which was pretty clean water. It was actually pretty nice. And it didn't run in the winter. There was too much snow. They didn't plow tracks. So it had a fairly short life. And the inside of that boiler was beautiful. The outside of the boiler, having the insulation held onto that shell with a sheet metal jacket on it, was horribly corroded. So we threw about 50% of that boiler away. And this is a drawing of the boiler that I did as a preparation for an argument that I really wanted to fix this boiler. We replaced all of the boiler going forwards. We took the steam dome off and we put a liner in it to bring it up to code and shot a bunch of stay bolts. We just did a phenomenal amount of work on it and restored the original boiler, well, pretty accurately. It was riveted. I mean, the original was riveted, but it was redesigned to meet modern code. So this is the boiler sort of sitting there waiting for us to get to it. Partially disassembled up in the boneyard. That's the barrel that we took off the front part of the boiler. That's the back half of the boiler, the part we saved. These are us driving rivets. I got my mouth open. I'm sure I'm saying something really important. But there's actually a hot rivet in that picture somewhere that's about to get hammered up. And we set it back in the frame that what had been previously restored. And we put it in the frame so we could get all the parts to line up so it would fit when we put it all together. And we just started adding little bits and pieces to it. Except for the fact that there still doesn't have all its rivets in it, it's really starting to look a lot like a locomotive. Well, it looks like a locomotive to me. There was a gentleman by the name of Eric Thompson who was probably born, I'm going to say he was born around 1900. I don't know when he was born. And Eric studied engineering, and he was of German stock. I think he was born in America, but his parents were definitely German. Crusty bastard, honestly. But he took a fancy to railroading, and he became a civil engineer in railroading. He designed road beds. That was his specialty. But when he was a young man, he wanted to build a model of a locomotive similar to this. Actually, it's the one down in Sacramento, the Sonoma, which instead of having 3 drivers, as this one does, has 2 drivers. It's American class. And so he wrote to the Baldwin Locomotive Company in the 20s and said, hey, you know, I really want to build a model of this. Do you have any drawings? Could you help me with a drawing? And they sent him a roll of paper that was phenomenal. Now, Eric got old, and before he died, he gave it to the California State Railroad Museum because they had the model. They had the real locomotive he wanted to model, and he did model it instead. So there's a wonderful set of drawings out. When this was built, the Sonoma hadn't been built yet. The Eureka was on the floor with this, and that's another Nevada narrow gauge locomotive that still exists. And so many of the appliances and fittings and sundry that were in the drawings would have been proper for this locomotive. So we bought a set of those drawings from the California State Railroad Museum. So we're up through, let me get the timeline together. So 87, we did the chassis. We tried to put the boiler in. We threw our hands in the air and said, rats. Discussed rebuilding the original boiler. We got some money. We went back to work on this locomotive. In the 90s, there was a little bit of work. Then something came up that was more important, or the money played out, however. Anyway, we get up to 2009, and the administrator of the Division of Museums and History, Mike Fisher, who lives in Minden, was appointed by Gibbons to be the administrator of the museums, and he wanted to leave a mark. Everybody wants to be remembered for something, and he said, what can we do that would be really great? Well, I was starting to get old by then, and I said, you know, I'm going to throw my hat in the ring. I said, we should fund the completion of this locomotive, because I took it apart. I have to put it back together. And he said, hey, that's a hell of an idea. And he went to the Wiegand Foundation, which is a very well-to-do foundation, and they gave us a bushel basket full of money, a disgusting amount of money. And I say disgusting because I've been living, you know, donation box to donation box on projects, and all of a sudden all this money came in. But we have all this money. We have Eric Thompson's drawings from Baldwin. It allowed us to, rather than buy generic valves and fittings and just do sort of what we can do to get along, it allowed us to go to a foundry and to make the accurate Baldwin hardware. So there's a water glass, partially machined, not completely machined, that came along. That's a tulip boiler for lubricating the locomotive. These were all castings that we had done. There it is a little bit further along. And that was really special because it allowed us to refine the accuracy of the restoration just really down to a knack. I show this picture because this device right here is an injector. There are no moving parts. Well, there's a valve and there's a lever. There's essentially no moving parts. And what happens is if you put cold water into it and you put steam into it, the cold water goes in the boiler. It is a mystic machine, absolutely magic. Railroads did not trust them, I think because nothing moved, but they worked. That's pretty weird. And they were invented by the French, and we did not really want to have any trouble. In fact, the story of building the injector is an absolutely fantastic story. There was a guy by the name of Giffard in France that wanted to build a lighter-than-air ship, a dirigible, if you will, a balloon thing, and he wanted to power it with steam, but a pump weighed so much, he sat down at the drawing board, he drew that thing, and it worked. Not that one, he built his own, and then this is a shooting according. But anyway, that's an 1885-ish photograph. We say that because of the lack of detail. They painted out the pinstriping, and it just kind of, we can sort of target that. Anyway, guy walks into the shop sometime in the 80s. He was in the 90s, I don't know what it was, and I have no idea who he is. And he had an injector. And he said, this is off the tugboat Hercules that's currently at Hyde Street Pier in San Francisco. It was spare in the room when it was last running, and when I retired, I took it because I thought it was a neat piece of hardware. And it looks like that. It's exactly the right one. God, I love serendipity. I really do. And it functions beautifully. So anyway, the shooting and courting was just down the road from Baldwin, and they were buying parts from them. This is on one side of the locomotive. Putting water in a boiler is a very important thing to do. On the other side is one of these. And this is a crosshead pump. It's a piston pump. Railroads liked the idea of injectors because there was very minimal maintenance on them, and they worked well, but they didn't really quite trust them. So they had one of these pumps, and as the piston goes back and forth, and the crosshead, the big square thing goes back and forth, it runs this plunger and it pumps water into the boiler. That's a real one. There are like 2 real ones of these in the United States, and this one runs. And it's delightful when it does, because if you're drifting along very quietly, you can hear the check valves kind of going clack, 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 clack. It's just very, very wonderful. So bits and pieces were coming together. The smokestack was in terrible condition, so Rick started whacking up a smokestack for us. Looks like that. And there it is on the locomotive. I'm kind of jumping around here on the time frame. So we put the locomotive together, rolled the tubes in, put a hydro on it, bought valves, relief valves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Put a fire in it. That's always a really big day. It was a cold, miserable day, but it worked out. We put a fire in it, and oh, there's the fire. And there's the water glasses. There's a tube in between the 2 pieces of the water glass we saw earlier. The tulip boilers are up on top between the gauge and the lubricator. There's a little T-handle thing up on top. And we had the opportunity to fabricate all those parts to get the restoration accurate. Oh, by the way, so we had this boiler that we got from Dixon Boiler Works that was supposed to replace this boiler, and it didn't fit. The Nevada County Narrow Gauge bought 2 of these locomotives. They bought the Glenbrook and they bought the Tahoe. They kept the Tahoe, and it lived down in Nevada City after this let, and then the movie companies bought it. And then Nevada County went down to the movie companies. Basically what happened is the movie companies bought a lot of railroad stuff for doing westerns, and then they just wore it out. And then they moved it along. They just didn't need it anymore. It was easier to build a new one than it was to repair the old one. Anyway, Nevada County got the Tahoe back. It ran on the railroad, the sister to this one, and its boiler was completely shot. In fact, they had just brutalized that boiler, unfortunately. We gave them the boiler that didn't fit, and they put it in their locomotive, and even though they didn't fit, they monkeyed around, and now it's running in Nevada County, down in there, outside of Nevada City. So, you know, everything works out in the end, sort of. Bits and pieces that we needed. We needed a new cab. If you bought a passenger locomotive in 1875, it came in an oiled finish, typically walnut. These would have been walnut cabs with a varnished finish or an oiled finish. This was a freight engine, a logging engine, so it was done in American ash. This is done in American ash, and then it was painted. This is actually a galvanized sheet metal roof, because the original roof was called turnplate, T-E-R-N-E, which is a lead wash plate. This is zinc wash plate. You can't buy turnplate anymore. People are so emphatically afraid of lead that it's no longer sold as a commodity, unfortunately. Anyway, it's a jigsaw puzzle, and after you get done, you solder it all together. It actually doesn't look too bad. I think that was done, among other things, so that you didn't burn the cab up with cinders that came out of the stack and sat on your roof. Just speculation on my part. And comes the big day, we go out there to put it on. Great, I'm going to digress. I was researching 14th century violin varnish. It just seemed like a good thing to do. I was actually on the clock with the state, and as long as the state's paying me, I'm going to research something that has nothing to do with anything. It turns out that the Italian violin makers all made their own varnish. Making varnish wasn't really that big a deal. It's not a difficult thing to make. And what they would do is they would make their varnish, and then they would tint their varnish with their own color. So you would have varnishes that were yellowish or perhaps green, or some of them were approximately tinted with that sort of eggplanty color. Now that color has always bothered me because I don't know what the pigment is. And I've never been able to find anybody who could tell me what that pigment was. And we've argued about what color that is for years. And while I was reading about 15th century violin makers' varnishes, it said that one of those guys, and I don't remember which one it was, used the root of the madder plant, M-A-D-D-E-R, which is a 2-year plant, grows for 2 years, then dies, and then it starts again. And you take the roots and you squash them, and you get that sort of purpley color out. And then you fix it with a mordant, which is the chemistry side of how do you get it into paint. And it took a long time to grow. It was an expensive pigment. It's known for a long, long time around the Mediterranean. The Egyptians used it 5,000 years ago to do textiles, but nobody ever grew enough matter and processed enough matter to paint anything that size. It was fine artists used it, violin makers, textile people used it. In the 1820s, again, a Frenchman, I don't know why they keep popping up, isolated this color out of madder root and identified the organic molecule that it was. And he went, ha-ha, there it is. And everybody, I guess they went, so what? But the Germans, not really liking the French, figured out what that chemical was from a perspective of how to make it from coal tars and made that pigment. And overnight, that color became a sensation in America. Like in 1869, there was a day when things turned purple. Before then, that color was non-existent in the industrial fine arts. That just tickles me pink. So we're setting the cab on. I don't know, these are just feel-good photographs for me because it was just a great project. So in the previous picture, we're setting the cab on, but you can see way on the far left side behind Wendell, the red boiler with the rivet head sticking out. So we haven't insulated it. We have not put the jacket on it. We put the cab on it. We drag it back in. We start jacketing it. The jacket of choice at that particular point in time was a product called Russia iron. And they called it Russia iron because they actually imported the jacket material from Russia. In the Urals, there was a mining district where they pulled high-grade iron ore out, they made steel, and then they processed it into a blue finish. And the finish, you stacked all the bare steel sheets up with coal in between them and Baltic fir logs, and you put them in a reverberatory furnace and you beat the hell out of them, and it took days and days and days. And the finish, we'll see it later on, comes out as a nice blue. So we blued this, horribly toxic process. I was told it couldn't be done, so I had to try it, and it worked. I've done several locomotives now. We got into painting. This is Lauren John, a Reno artist. This would have been done by a sign painter. We need to differentiate between Lauren and reality here. Lauren is an artist. He did not letter the locomotive and stripe these parts. He painted them. His work is impeccable. I mean, it is absolutely gorgeous. I think it's a little over-restoration because of the meticulous nature to which he was doing this, but the work is absolutely spectacular. The headlamp. So we have the three patterns, the tender pattern, the side of the headlamp, and then that's the sand dome over there. The sand dome sits on the locomotive, you fill it full of sand, trickles down onto the rails, provides adhesion. It's like putting ice or sand on ice, so it's a little more grippy. I contracted with an art historian in Southern California who did a spectacular report on not only what the patterns were, using information that was available, photographs, the Baldwin books out of Bancroft and a lot of other things, but he also sort of wrote about why people did this and how fine arts industrial was an aesthetic exercise where we could showcase our grandeur. We got away with it. We got way away from that with Carnegie and Roosevelt and all those big guys. They wanted them black. They wanted to go to work. They wanted the money. They didn't really care. When he submitted that document to me, I read it, and I told him he needed to go back to school and submit it as a master's thesis because this is an outstanding piece of work. But anyway, I digress. Nice stuff. Here we can see the imitation Russia iron jacket. We're still putting it together. Bits and pieces are going on to it. It's starting to look pretty locomotive-like. And we're sort of coming to the end. So this is it. 1878, I think. You can still see there's a nice detail on the domes, and there's some pinstriping. In the original photograph, it actually shows up fairly well. obviously pretty bright. Up in the window of the cab, there's a sunburst up there. There's a great photograph of that sunburst, more square on, probably taken the same day. We actually reproduced that, put it in the window for a while. Sort of nice. And then that's what it ended up looking like when we got all done with it. This locomotive runs at original operating pressure, exactly the way it's supposed to run. And we had the opportunity in 2023 to take it to Colorado, to the Cumbres and Toltec Railroad that has a 60-mile railroad that goes over the Continental Divide. And we ran this locomotive at speed with tonnage for 10 days straight with no mechanical issues. And we were in the train with the Eureka and Palisade locomotive that, number 4, the Eureka, that ran out from Eureka up to, Palisade, on the river, on the Humboldt River. Also restored. I worked on that one, and it was spectacular. It's nice to be able to take them out and prove that they do what they're supposed to do. Anyway, that's about all I have to say. Actually, I got a lot more to say, but I noticed that it was a 35 to 45-minute talk. I will take questions. Yeah?
So what's the benefit of the narrow gauge railroads? Is it just that they're
That's a great
cheaper,
question.
or?
If you have an operation that you do not believe is going to actually be viable as a business for a long period of time, like the Transcontinental Railroad, that's 1868 to date. I mean, it's still going. But a lot of the railroads, mining and logging specifically, they went in to go after a resource. They knew what the life of the resource was going to be approximately, and they didn't want to spend a lot of money, but they needed to get the stuff out because it's either horses and wagons or locomotives. Narrow gauge railroads allow you to grade a smaller roadbed width-wise, go around tighter corners, use shorter ties, and lighter rail. And that is why we have the narrow gauge system, basically, in the western United States. There's a little bit back east, but not very much, but there was a lot out there. That's a good question. Yeah, anybody got a question? Yeah.
On the switchbacks that you showed at the beginning of your talk,
Yes.
it looks like the train on its first leg pulled the load and then switched to go up a switchback, pushing the load?
Pushing the load, yes.
Again? Okay.
Yeah. And yeah, and you got to stop them before they go off the end of the trestle there into space. We have no record that one ever went off the end. And I imagine if you did this, 5 or 6 days a week, 40 hours a week, or whatever it was, you'd know where to stop because cars were the same length, locomotives the same length. It's always the same length. So. Yeah.
So when you went back to Colorado with this, did you truck it?
Yeah. Everything on the property at the Nevada State Railroad Museum came in on truck. We've moved some ferociously big stuff.
So you didn't have enough railroad track to get there.
Oh, well, it's narrow gauge. So you can-
Well, there's no rail connection between Reno and Carson City anymore, and as the gentleman pointed out, that's narrow gauge. Of course, the V&T had a transfer flat car, and it's currently in the shop undergoing restoration. Carson City was the main industrial complex in northern Nevada for a long time. So if you needed something big and industrial, that's where you went. And there were a lot of narrow gauge railroads out and about served by standard gauge lines. So if you need to send your locomotive in to get repaired or whatever, you put it on a transfer car and haul it into Carson City. And the Carson City, or the V&T, the Virginia Truckee Railroad, owned a car, Allison Transfer number 1. And it's undergoing restoration because we're running out of floor space, so we're just going to put a locomotive on it and park it. Yeah.
So the railroad ties at the time, were they treated somehow like creosote, like they are up until fairly recently, or they just wood and when they rotted out, you put a new one?
When did Drake drill a hole in the ground of Pennsylvania and discover oil?
I don't know.
1870 something, but I can't remember. So prior to that, there wasn't any creosote. And so treated ties, I don't know when treated ties came in. But labor was cheap. There was a hell of a lot of wood around. I mean, we hadn't logged it all off. So changing out a tie is not a big deal. In fact, the Transcontinental Railroad, most of it wasn't built on milled lumber. They took round logs and notched little adze a little flat spot and nailed the rails to it. If you look at the old pictures when they were building it, they were just round logs.
One, like up to Virginia City or back, or?
No,
Where is
Virginia
it-
City,
Where is it at right now?
it's in Carson City.
It's in Carson City,
Yeah,
okay.
that's its home. And no, but we did take it to Colorado and run on a 60-mile road out there. There's a great video. I'm not really very good with these machines. There's a great video of this and a train out in Colorado thundering across the Sagebrush. And it looks like Nevada. It really is really very, very pretty in my opinion. If I knew how to get it on there, I would have put it right, but I don't know how that works. One of the things that fascinates me are finishes. When I say that, I'm talking about paint. At this point in time, paint was only put on with a brush. They hadn't invented spray painting. And it was lead-based paint. In other words, it was white lead pigments, vehicles, dryers, blah, 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 blah. That's all painted with lead-based paint. Do not lick that locomotive if you come to our museum. So.
Are those its original color? See,
Yeah. Yep. Oh, if you do come to the museum and you look, there's a casting right underneath this cab that sort of supports the cab. And we got the original colors for the pinstriping and the body there, and there's a window in that fresh paint job of the original factory paint where it just comes over, puts and boxes it in with a couple of stripes going through it. And yeah, we're pretty close.
yeah, you went around the yard there?
Oh, we have about a mile of track.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, and most of it's 3-railed. So 2 rails and standard gauge, and put a 3rd rail in.
So you get out on this.
Oh yeah. And I invite you to come down sometime this summer. I go on web and find out when. But the Tahoe's coming over from Nevada City, and we're going to run both of them together. So.
Yeah, I see the gondola back there.
Well, that's a tender. That's the 25 tender. Yeah.
Yeah, is that off the train that goes up to Virginia City, or is that?
This is a Virginia and Truckee locomotive, but it's the states, and the railroad that's in Virginia City is privately owned. The rolling stock is, and the railroad is owned by the Tri-County Commission, something, and I don't know who they are. They had enough money to rebuild the building. Yeah.
Since Nevada County is sending their train over, would there ever be some event where the Glenbrook and the Tahoe go to Virginia City? Could you?
No, you can't run there. It's standard gauge.
It's standard gauge.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
thank
yeah.
you.
In fact, this rail is standard gauge, and this rail is the narrow gauge rail, and there's a common rail on the other side of the locomotive. However, that could go to Virginia City. You know, we talk about it, but we never do it, for crying out loud. Yeah. Question.
So on the boiler, is
Yeah.
that a single pass boiler?
Yeah. It's a big.
So there's a lot of waste of heat going out.
Oh, are you kidding me? So if you run the numbers on this, you put a thermostat in the stack and you start weighing the water in, and you only use the steam once, and you don't recondense it and use it. Yeah, we're running 3 to 5% efficiency on this. Not kidding. That's where they are. Yeah.
How much water does it use, like per mile or 10 miles? How much water would it through there?
So there are so many variables in that. Are you going uphill? Are you going downhill? How fast are you running? How much tonnage are you pulling? I will tell you that this locomotive would not go from Glenbrook to Spooner Summit on one tender of water. They ran out of water kind of up at where the state park at the bottom of North Canyon there, just like literally 2 miles short of where they needed to be. And they went in and they expanded the water capacity on the tender internally to hold another 200 gallons so they could do the whole job. So that works out to pulling that load of lumber up that hill, 13 miles roughly. Yeah, I should know this. How much water does that thing hold? It holds like 720 gallons of water. So, you know, Do the math, I don't know. Yeah, gentleman in the back.
That, the flume that you showed the pictures of.
Yeah.
It looked like that was a fairly small plume. Did the timbers go down single file?
Yes, they did, number one. Number two, it didn't use a lot of water. When there was no lumber in the flume, there was probably like 4 to 6 inches of water in that feed trough. And they were shipping down 12 by 12s and 16 by 16s or whatever. But when you set milled lumber into a V flume and it sits down into that notch, the water comes up around it, and that the lumber would go down with like half an inch of water. And then when wintertime came in and started to freeze, it would just go down on ice. Seriously. Yeah.
How did you get that to Colorado?
Put it on a truck. Yeah. It doesn't weigh much. It weighs like 23 tons. I mean, it's not much. Yes?
Is this what you thought you were going to be doing when you grew up? Is this what you always wanted?
Oh, no. When I went to Davis, I was studying materials science, and then I went to Berkeley and studied solid state physics, and then I went into engineering. God, that was a horrible thing to do. I kind of found myself in a cubicle with fluorescent lights. I didn't know what was going on outside doing cookbook engineering. It's like, no. So
what projects are you working on now?
we got the transfer car. We're winding that one up. That's coming up for painting and lettering. And a deck. So that'll go out. The standard gauge locomotive Inyo 1875 has finally died. The boiler has worn itself out. When that was built, it was not intended to live for 149 years and 8 months. But we got it that far, but now we're going to go through and do a comprehensive overhaul of the boiler, much like we did to this one. And I have 2 rifled ordnances out of Fort Churchill that we're restoring for the Parks Department. And when I went out there, I love this. They said, "Oh, can you restore these?" And I said, what level of restoration do you want?" And they said, "We want to shoot them." And I said, "I'm your guy." So, yeah.
Did you dare to estimate the total cost to restore those, the engine and the tender?
Yeah, I can tell you what the grants were, but I cannot tell you what the hours are because we're on payroll, and if we're not doing this, then we're sweeping the floor, we're running a locomotive, or talking to the public, or what have you. But it came in like about $400,000 worth of grants for material, outside services, corrections, the work previously done. You go $400,000. That's nothing today. My God, people are buying cars that cost more than that.
That includes bat boiling?
Yes. Yeah.
So if you went down to the railroad place that builds those, then in 1875, what would it have cost?
$8,000. And I don't know what a dollar was worth in 1875. But this was like $7,982.24 or something. But I can't give you a comparison because I don't know what the dollar was worth. I don't know what a loaf of bread cost in 1875. Oh, hand up over there.
How long did it take the manufacturer build from date of order till?
These guys were knocking these things out like Liberty ships in World War II. I kid you not. From the start to the end was like 4 months. But it was a big, big company. Many people working. Well, if I get any more questions, I'd like to say thank you very much for listening to me rattle on.